Iraq's political leaders, they met to discuss their country's future, but is it yet fully in their hands? 8 years after the US-led invasion, questions are still being asked at the highest levels. Will American troops stay longer than planned? Can the politicians work towards the greater good? All told, what is it that prevents Iraq from moving forward? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. 8 years after that US-led invasion to topple Saddam Hussein, Iraq remains one of the most volatile of places. We know that. Iraq's politicians certainly know that, which is one of the reasons they've held a major meeting under the auspices of the president, Jalal Talabani, on a whole host of issues facing their country. In fact, in a way, it started on Saturday when Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki delivered a speech to Parliament about shrinking the size of the Iraqi government. After that speech, Parliament then voted to eliminate 14 departments, including the Ministries of State for Tribal Affairs and Parliament Affairs. But now another issue is back, the US presence in Iraq. About 44,000 US troops remain in the country, down from about 170,000 at the peak of the war, with the full withdrawal scheduled for the end of the year. But even that's up for debate now. And one of the things both Iraqi and US leaders are now looking for is some sort of final decision on whether those remaining US troops should stay or should go. So there's two main issues, if you like, certainly the ones we're going to discuss today. The external one, that concerns the US troops. Also the internal ones involving Iraqi politics, and that's where we're going to start. This current government is the largest in Iraq's history, 46 members. But with Nouri al-Maliki's cuts, a third will go, bringing the number down to 34. He also made some military decisions, going to double the number of F-16 fighter jets to 36. But there are other disagreements which still exist between the two biggest blocs in the government. That is the State of Law coalition led by the Prime Minister and the Al-Iraqiyya bloc of former Prime Minister Iyad Allawi. So we're going to talk about those differences and all sorts of other issues with our guest today as we try to figure out what it is that's truly preventing Iraq from moving forward. Here's our panel for today. In Baghdad, Saad al-Muttalabi, a former political advisor to the Iraqi government. In Birmingham, Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. Mr. Lucas, also the editor of EA Worldview. And rounding out our panel in Washington, D.C., it's Anas Al-Takriti, the CEO of the Cordoba Foundation, a group seeking to promote dialogue between the Muslim world and the West. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Thank you for your time. Saad al-Muttalabi, let me start with you, seeing as you are there in the middle of it all in Baghdad. I know that politics by its very nature is divisive. You have two sides of the political divide, if not more. In Iraq, the difference is that they need unity. The politicians need some sort of unity, the greater good, to move the country forward after everything it's been through. In your opinion, what is it that holds Iraq back from finding that greater good?
Yes, thank you very much. This is, you put your finger on it. I think, and not only me, I think there's a host of analysts and people in Iraq think that political parties haven't agreed yet to the national principles. National principles that all should agree on, a shared future for Iraq, which include everybody in that shared vision of a future. The problem that we still, on different levels, expect different things from Iraq or expect different issues from the state of Iraq. Excuse me. There is still an argument on the identity of Iraq. Is it a central, distributed powers, federal, confederal?
Let's bring in Anas Al-Takriti in Washington, D.C. for his points. Saad al-Muttalabi was talking about a shared future. Is that actually possible in Baghdad with the type of political divide that is there?
I think you asked the right question. I think that the main problem lies in the very making of the political structure that we've had since 2003. The very nature of the political system is the biggest impediment towards the quite rosy and quite optimistic vision that Saad al-Muttalabi proposed. The question that I would like to ask Saad when he comes back online is, he was advisor to the government. The government is responsible for promoting and activating such ambitions and objectives. Why didn't it? I think you'd find that part of the blame lies within the government itself, as well as part of the blame lies with the political elements that make up the form of the government, the formation of the political strand in Iraq. But ultimately it's the mechanism itself, it's the dynamics itself. You will find that despite the elections, despite the negotiations, despite the coalitions, despite all the very promising emblems and slogans that were raised over the past few years, nothing has happened. And I mean nothing, i.e. zero. Nothing has happened. And the reason is because the structure itself, the system itself, is the greatest enemy and the greatest impediment to that being achieved.
And so something like downsizing the government, even by a third, which is pretty major, that's just cosmetic then?
Extremely cosmetic, and particularly because one thing that very few people have been talking about outside Iraq, and that is the fact that the 4 or 5 ministries that al-Maliki is cutting are really neither here or there. But the fact is that 8 years on from the fall of the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath regime, we have come full circle, and we are back to where we started, with the most important ministries, i.e. the defense, the interior, as well as the security, intelligence and national security, are all in the hands of Nouri al-Maliki, because for the past 6 to 8 months he has failed to appoint any ministers, and therefore, according to the constitution, it's down to him to run those ministries. So we have come, after 8 years, full circle back to a one-man rule. One man who is free to mobilize and to move any part of the security apparatus as he wishes and no one can say no, simply because he's working according to the constitution.
Scott Lucas in Birmingham, Nouri al-Maliki is not coming out of this looking too well at the moment, certainly in our discussion. Is that the problem? He's too weak, I guess some people accuse him of. He's not winning any favour from making cosmetic changes?
I'm not sure our discussion makes a difference. I think Mr. Al-Takriti put it in a nutshell, and that is, if he basically controls the important ministries, if he controls the ministries which are in charge of internal security, in charge of external defense, if he controls the ministries in charge of the economy, he's got the levers of power. And as long as he has the levers of power and there's no challenge to that, in other words, from Parliament or from a judiciary or from a political party with a wide base of support, he has the upper hand in any negotiations that take place. There certainly will be challenges from other groups, such as the forces of Muqtada al-Sadr, but at this point, he who has the power holds it until there's some basically counter, some challenge, because the way the system's set up. It's absolutely right. The system is gamed right now to even when you have no one with a majority of support from the Iraqi public, that one person can at least have overall control.
So he's got the levers of power, but isn't necessarily doing anything with them. Where does that leave the Alawi bloc? Because you would think if the leadership is not looking good, there should be a way in, a political way in, if you like, for the Alawi bloc, for the opposition.
But how does the Alawi bloc do it? I mean, there's really no way that it can be done through Parliament, the way that the relationship is between the legislature and the executive right now. It certainly can't be done through the military or through the security services. So you have to talk about a frontal political challenge. So does the Alawi bloc completely pull out and say we'll have no role in the government whatsoever, putting itself on the outside? Or does it stay on the inside and engage in what are basically these long, inconclusive discussions? The fact is, this goes back to the inconclusive national election that was held, followed by several months of stalemate. And when at the end of several months of stalemate, whether it was through internal agreement or whether there was external pressure, when Mr. al-Maliki was allowed to be renamed as leader of the country, that was the decisive moment. And right now, the Alawi bloc doesn't really have, I think, a major lever to overturn that.
Anas Al-Takriti, where would the Alawi bloc be best positioned? Like Scott was saying, they could stay on the inside or they could get out and make a challenge. Is it 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in the end for them?
Well, yes, I agree. I mean, the problem is that the options available to the Alawi bloc are extremely limited, despite the fact that they were the bloc that actually won in terms of the numbers of votes, won the elections, despite the fact that they do represent a wider and more varied section of Iraqi society. But despite that, at this moment of time, they can either agree to be totally submissive to al-Maliki's overall strongman rule, which, by the way, he is establishing day after day after day, even through the establishment of extra militia, of contra militia groups claiming that they are for anti-terrorist activities and the such. So they can either, just bite the bullet and just go with the flow and wait for another 2 years until the next elections comes by, and hopefully they'll win by a greater majority, or the other option is to actually bring Parliament to deliver a vote of no confidence and start all over again. The fact is, I mean, as we're talking here about political point scoring, political vying, about some sort of power dynamics going on, we opt to mention, and we omit to mention the fact that Iraq is a country, the Iraqis as a society are essentially being ruled, and since the elections a year and a half ago, 18 months ago, with no effective government. I mean, every day there are problems that every one of us can't even begin to imagine, yet those problems are not being addressed properly simply because the government is ineffective. So I think that what we need to look at this moment of time is where we can start to untangle this whole web. Obviously, there's an external factor here, and I'm sure that the line of questioning, Kamal, will come to that. But there is an external element to be had. Of course. You must bear in mind the fact that every single strategic decision in Iraq is actually made outside Iraq, not inside Iraq. It's either in Washington, in Europe, or in Tehran, or somewhere else regionally. So I think that there are a number of factors. Otherwise, we will continue in this stalemate. We will continue in this stalemate until, I don't know what, maybe the Iraqi people will rise as their Arab brethren and topple the whole thing. Maybe. Okay. But at this moment of time, things look very, very bleak.
We'll bring in those external forces a little bit later on. Let's bring in Saad Mutalabi again from Baghdad as a former advisor to the Iraqi government. Our other guests are suggesting that, as you said also, the system is at fault, but that Nouri al-Maliki has the power, has the levers of power, is what Scott Lucas said, and he's not using them properly. And that is one of the major reasons why this government and this country can't move forward. Your reaction to that?
No, I don't think that's very accurate. There is a certain element to that, since he is the acting Minister of Defense and acting Minister of Interior. But other than that, all security decisions are made in the National Security Council, which consists of, other than the security ministers are involved with that, is the Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Ministry of Justice.
Well, I guess I've already raised the issue of external forces, so let's talk about that now. I want to take you through the deal that is known as SOFA, the US-Iraqi Status of Forces Agreement. This is crucial to everything from here on in. It does concern the withdrawal of US forces from Iraq and the organisation of their activities whilst they are still there. Just for a timeline, it was approved by Iraq's Presidential Council back in December of 2008, a while ago now. The withdrawal itself to begin about 6 months later, June 30, 2009, and to be completed by December 31st, 2011, incredibly just 5 months from now. This is all supposed to happen. Scott Lucas, let's bring you back into the conversation at this point. Admiral Mike Mullen's in Baghdad at the moment, in Iraq, and he said, I'm quoting here, "Now is the time we have to know." In other words, are we going to stick to this timeline, or do you being the Iraqis, want the troops to stay longer? Iraq has got to make some sort of decision here and make it quickly.
Well, the Americans are trying to basically prejudge the decision. That's the important point here. First of all, just to refer to the States of Forces Agreement that you mentioned from 2008, and this is very important. It's a myth that it called for a full withdrawal of U.S. forces by the end of 2011. What it called for was a withdrawal of all U.S. combat forces. You can relabel the forces as logistical forces or as advisory forces, and they can stay in the country. And even back, I remember at the end of 2008, there were some of us, myself included, who were saying, look, the Americans will continue to try to retain about 50,000 troops in the country. And that's the case right now. And my belief is that they will try to pressure the al-Maliki government, whether or not the Prime Minister wants this. They'll try to pressure the government into allowing those more than 40,000 U.S. troops to stay well beyond 2011. Why is that? it's not as much for Iraqi security as much as the Americans see it as maintaining a regional presence. And when we mean regional presence, it means the Americans are seen to have a force not only versus Tehran, versus the Iranian foe, but also in terms of being there alongside or maneuvering with other Arab states, including Saudi Arabia. The United States doesn't want to give up that position, so it will be interesting to see, and this may be where the question goes, how Mr. al-Maliki reacts.
Well, what
to
about
that
a more simplified?
American
What about a more simplified argument, Scott? And perhaps I'm being a little bit naive here, but let's put the idea out there: the fact that the troops or the troop presence needs to be reconsidered simply because of the way things are, the product of the conflict as it's progressed since it was signed. Maybe the game's changed since then.
Well, I fully agree with you. That's what should happen. I mean, if we're talking about Iraq being first and foremost in the question, the foremost question should be Iraqi security. Who should maintain it? Should it be Iraqi national forces? Should it be a combination of Iraqi national and local forces? Do the Americans have any role whatsoever in that combination? But that's not what we're talking about here. The first issue is what the Americans do, not what happens with Iraqi security. The Americans will say, they'll make the argument, and some Iraqis will agree with them, that if the U.S. troops leave, that will lead to insecurity within Iraq. Fair enough, and we could talk about the discussion on those bases, but that more often is used as an excuse for the Americans to try to maintain their presence rather than the actual starting point of the discussion.
Anas al-Takriri, get the crystal ball out for me and tell me what you think would happen if and when U.S. troops leave. Scott gave the idea that security might fall apart, that the Iraqis aren't ready to. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I don't think they are going to leave. I mean, let's put it like that. I think that we are just vying with time. I think that's an invitation from the Iraqi government to the Americans for the forces to stay will be forthcoming soon. In fact, I like Scott. 3 years ago on Al Jazeera, I actually argued with an Iraqi official and an American official and stated at the time when the SOFA came and emerged, I said that 3 years down the line, the American forces will not withdraw. And at the time, my co-panelists dismissed those claims. Now we're here. It's very, very clear that every single Iraqi party thinks, including al-Maliki, by the way, thinks that it is in the best interest of Iraq for the Americans to stay. Now, people say this for a variety of reasons, each from their own respective point of view. I think that the biggest element in this is that the Iraqi forces are in nowhere near being ready to shoulder 100% the security and stability of Iraq and the policing of Iraq, and that I think is going to be the biggest element.
And what's
the
other
thing
here?
is that
sorry, let me just jump in really quickly. Are the Iraqi politicians, do they just not want to admit this? We've had a timeline in place for 3 years now, 2-3 years. Do they just not want to say, look, we're not ready and we need you to stay?
It would serve al-Maliki, for instance, I mean, no interest whatsoever to make such a claim. I mean, after all, he's been the Prime Minister for a number of years now. So, and he's the acting, military chief in command. So it's it comes down to him. But the other parties, they will also say that the problem is that if the Americans leave a vacuum, and we are talking hypothetically here, the forces that are most capable of filling that vacuum are not the Iraqi forces, but rather Iranian and militia factions, and that is why it's best for the Americans to stay for a longer while. The main problem is that once again we're coming down to an utter failure. We're talking about a state of failure after failure, including, and I'm not being facetious here, including the satellite link we have with Iraq in this program. I mean, there is nothing that works in this country. Electricity doesn't work, communications don't work, economy doesn't work, security doesn't work. Nothing works. Nothing is happening in Iraq. And the utter state of failure, the state of corruption is something that I think speaks volumes of every single person who bought into this structure, this system that delivered Iraq to where we are today.
Gentlemen, what is concerning for everyone, it doesn't matter what side of the political divide you come from, and certainly for the people of Iraq, is that the country is quite possibly more dangerous now than it was a year ago. Certainly that is what we've heard from a US watchdog group, which, if you like, oversees military operations there. The report cited frequent bombings, assassinations, a general resurgence in violence. Also cited the 15 US soldiers killed in June of this year, the worst month for US military for 2 years in Iraq. Also noted an increase in rocket attacks on Baghdad's green zone, and it singled out the northeastern province of Diyala as being particularly violent. Scott Lucas, this could just be a spike, couldn't it? It could just be, as they're talking about, a variation of this conflict as it's gone over 8 years. Regardless of whether it's an upsurge or a spike, is it something the Iraqis possibly could have dealt with on their own, thus proving that America needs to stay?
Yeah, you're talking about, you're asking for pie in the sky here. The fact is that Iraq, fundamentally, whether or not there's ups and downs in the statistics, is an insecure country. Not just simply because of the notion of militias or of military conflict, but because of basically day-to-day crime. At the end of the day, unless you have a functioning police and security force in which all Iraqis have trust, in which Sunni, Shia, Kurdish communities all agree on that force, then you're basically going to have an alternative which emerges, which is you're going to have rival forces, rival groups. Some of them may receive support from outside, such as from Tehran. Some of them may be alongside other foreign groups like the Americans. I slightly disagree. I really respect what Mr. Al-Takriti says. I slightly disagree. I don't see the Americans being part of the solution here. I think, in a sense, they become bystanders. Now, various Iraqi groups will try to ask for the Americans to say, because they'll try to use that American presence to support their own interests. Certainly Mr. al-Maliki will try to do that in the end. Other politicians may try to maneuver the Americans to support them as well. But I think the Americans, ironically, having gone in to remake Iraq, in a sense almost become the pawns in this game of insecurity that we're talking about.
Anas Al-Takriti, quick response from you.
You're absolutely right, Scott. I totally agree with you. It's basically each political party is saying, well, I'm not going to say it. I'm waiting for the other to say it. So Alawi wants the Americans to stay. He's not going to say it. He's going to wait for al-Maliki to come out, admit that he wants them to stay as well. So, and whilst they're playing this game, Iraq is stuck. Once again, this is a country that was delivered the wrong political structure in the wrong way. I agree with you entirely, Scott. The Americans were part of the problem. They remain to be part of the problem. They cannot be seen as part of the solution. But the problem is, at this moment of time, is that we have the scenario where you have to choose between the worst and the lesser of the two evils. There is no good scenario out of this. And ultimately speaking, we're talking about a failed state. We're talking about a failed political structure. I don't like to talk about security and instability and terrorism and extremism and all those issues simply because they are a reason. They are a justification for the Americans, for the Iranians, for the regional powers to play their game on the level playing field of Iraq. Unfortunately, the victims of all this and the victims that have been over the past 8 years have been the Iraqi people. Very few people talk about them. Unfortunately, we're talking politics. We're not talking about what's happening on the ground.
Well, no, let's talk about that. Let's think about the cost of this war, because you've pointed out the human cost, and we'll come to that, but certainly the financial cost, if you like, is a big reason for Americans to want to get out. The US government spent about $900 billion to date on Iraq. Some estimates show this could reach up to $1 trillion. And then, as Anas was just saying, the human cost of the war. First, on the coalition side, 4,785 troops killed. Among those, 4,469 US soldiers. But that number of Iraqi casualties so high, some estimates put it at over 600,000. Then, as of May 2007, you've got about 2.25 million Iraqis displaced inside the country, more than 2 million more refugees outside Syria and Jordan. Anas, I'll come to you first and then to Scott. The fact is, I don't think anyone will ever look at this as money well spent, just because, as we said, there's just been such a huge human cost. But the fact is, if you're going to spend that much money and time, Iraq has got to go somewhere from this. There's got to be something to show at the end of the day.
Ultimately speaking, you're absolutely right. I mean, we count the pennies and the pounds, but we don't count the cost of human lives. At this moment of time, we have more than 2.5 million Iraqis displaced, either within Iraq or outside Iraq. We have countless, and I mean countless, we simply don't know, who have died or whose lives have been immeasurably damaged as a result of this conflict. The refugee situation still, I was actually quite intrigued by the fact that 2 years ago in Europe, the European Union stated that the largest waves of refugees over the past 5 years into Europe came from the Kurdish region. Now I ask, we're told time and time again, Kurdistan is a safe and prosperous region. Why on earth then are still hordes of Kurds, dozens, thousands, possibly even tens of thousands, still emigrating into Europe to work on measly jobs simply to stay alive, if Kurdistan is such a prosperous nation. Once again, we're talking about a failed state, and a failed state which, unfortunately, my own country, the United Kingdom, as well as the United States, played a hefty and large and significant part in establishing and creating.
Gentlemen, this has been a great discussion. I want to thank you for your time. Saad al-Mutalabi with us from Iraq, Scott Lucas in Birmingham, and Anas El-Takriti in Washington, D.C. Thank you. And you, our viewers, of course, thank you for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. Send in your comments and your suggestions, won't you? The email address is insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, goodbye for now.